back to the Business Afterlife show. This is the Trending Economic Issues segment where we bring you exclusive technical analysis of economic issues happening across the African continent on some selected countries as well. But let me remind you, this segment is sponsored by today's newspaper. Every day you just go to the newsstand and you grab a copy of today. We have the front pages of it. You just go, you see, Indum opens rice mill factory at Wara as it's expected to create 5,000 jobs. On the page as well, on the story on page 3. Also, bomb scare hits Kumasi, as well as the Ghana reduces HIV prevalence, according to the United Nations report. Many stories in today's newspaper this morning. You can just go straight to any newsstand in the country and you get a copy of today's newspaper at an affordable price. Very, very content-oriented, comprehensive newspaper in Ghana's media landscape. So that will be it for this morning. We're going straight to issues happening across the African continent and many more best being discussed here in Ghana in the financial market. You can as well join the conversation by sending your thought to the WhatsApp line, which will be displayed on your screens, as well as the phone number. And let's get interactive right here on the Trending Economic Issues segment. This morning, to help me discuss the issue or to join me discuss the issue, I have Courage Kingsley Mate. He's an economist with Data Bank Group here with me in the studio. Good morning, Courage.
Good morning, Winston.
How have you been?
Well, we thank God for life.
Hope the week smooth and, business-oriented as always.
Yeah, sure. Giving our best.
There are many times you just recited a sure means that you are too sure of yourself.
Well, not that I'm too sure of myself, but I trust in the Lord with all I do. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6.
Amen. Amen. Glory be to God. And now we go straight to business as always. In Ghana's landscape, it appears there's been a lot of conversation about how we use our oil revenue. Africa Center for Energy Policy has always called for transparency in utilization of oil revenue, and most institutions have also talked about the same conversation. But it appears, according to recent interaction with the Finance Minister, Seth Terkper, he came out with a quite revealing conversation, or let's say statement, which has to do with offsetting borrowed monies in the country. In 2017, there are a lot of monies whose interest, let's say bonds, which we need to offset in order to move forward. But he said very interesting in that Ghana's oil revenue is likely to be used to offset borrowing. He added that what that meant was that we are not refinancing. Before then, let me take a very interesting remark that he made yesterday. Say, we are going to continue to set aside the oil revenues to pay down some of the borrowing. There is nothing that says we should only be refinancing, he said in an interview exclusively within the week. He also went ahead to make a clear statement. He said, we couldn't accumulate $750 million to pay in 3 years, but I'm proud to say that we were able to buy back or to pay down $133 million from our own resources. This was end of quote made by Seth Terkper. But let's get interactive with this issue about the use of the oil revenue. Per your assessment, we've gotten enough. We've been able to accumulate a bit of as expected. But would you say we've been judiciously using revenues to offset certain critical projects in the country to the benefit of ordinary Ghanaians in the country?
Well, when it comes to using of oil revenue to develop certain critical sectors, I think that there's still a lot that can be done. It begins with the level of expectations we have about the oil revenue. And I think that the expectation itself falls flat on it, because the amount of revenue we get from crude oil far fall short of the expected revenue we think we would get. And that is where you would think that if you measure the revenues that are coming in against the expectations, you think that we have not done quite well, But I think expectations need to be managed and needs to be trimmed, because even on the output side of crude oil, we've not really hit that our potential just yet. You can pick the Jubilee oil field, for instance, which has a maximum production capacity of about 120,000 barrels per day. And I think last year, 2015, was the highest we achieved of an average of 102,000 barrels per day. This year, we're expecting to do 74,000 barrels per day because of the problems we have with the FPSO on the Jubilee oil field. And that makes it very likely that next year also, we may not do up to or close to our capacity. The reason why I'm saying this is because about half of next year will be used to repair the FPSO, and about 8 to 12 weeks of shutdown will be experienced during the repair period. And so that will have impact on oil production. Now, once oil production has been negatively impacted, and God knows what will happen to crude oil. Currently, it doesn't look too good. It was above $50 for some time, but as at yesterday, it has fallen below $50 because of what's happening within OPEC. And if oil prices are also not strong, then price times quantity should give you your total revenue. It means that your lower quantity times lower prices will give you lower total revenue. Once you get lower total revenue, then the ability to expand infrastructure and other sectors of the economy will be constrained. You see, so that it is against this backdrop that I think that expectations should be managed so that we can use the monies judiciously and not try to meet each and every expectation, and then which will ultimately lead to waste of resources.
Sometimes we make projections like the government always makes, but it appears the first 9 months, the production in the oil production has fallen to less than 1,000 barrels per day. But going forward, how will this affect revenue going forward? And also, if it will, would you say we have enough buffer to offset any shortfall in international pricing?
Okay, so first of all, the lower output will definitely affect revenue projections, and so we need to be careful. I think oil revenue as a percentage of the budget is under 5%. So I do not think that it should cause a lot of concern for government. I'm always surprised when government cries, trouble because of falling oil price or falling production, as far as revenue is concerned, or as far as the budget side is concerned, because oil revenue is only about maximum 5% of the total budget. You can get revenue from other sources if you manage your fiscal operations very well. But then it will still be some negative impact. We cannot run away from that fact. And then in terms of the impact it will also have on our ability to accumulate funds, it will also negatively impact us because part of the oil revenue is split between the fiscal stabilization, the stabilization, Ghana Stabilization Fund, and the Heritage Fund. And now you also are supposed to have part of it going into the sinking fund, which is supposed to be used to buy back or pay down existing debts. So if you have this revenue coming down, then it means that not only are your development projects going to suffer, your other funds that takes bits and pieces of this revenue will also suffer. The main pressure will now be on the stabilization fund, which every now and then we keep revising the cap so that we can get some excesses to split across the sinking fund and other projects. Now, what it will mean is that the stabilization fund will not be able to accumulate so much. And the stabilization fund is set up so that in periods where revenues are falling below expectation, you can also fall on it. But here's a case where we've had a period of about 2 years or so that revenue has not been that strong. So over the last 2 years, the stabilization fund ultimately, and as a consequence, will also suffer. And so we will not be able to accumulate that much also there to follow when prices continue to be low.
The instance of governments always earmarking the oil revenue as one pot that they can put their hands in to finance critical projects amidst the already agreed transaction where government can only borrow 5% from the Bank of Ghana to finance capital projects. Currently, we've seen yesterday that government was able to pass 4 different loans in the House of Parliament within 2 hours. Looking at how things are happening, is that a reflection of a panic attack or a repercussion of the 5% decision that we took, not taking into consideration the other factors involved?
Well, the 5% that was signed, I believe, is something that may not happen under the IMF program, because what you've agreed with the IMF is 0%. Now, it means that you will not borrow from the central bank, even when your revenue do not perform well. So a consequence of that is higher borrowing. So I won't be surprised that the government is pushing through some other loan agreements through Parliament to be able to get some money coming in through borrowing. Because when there is a shortfall in revenue, the financing source can either be getting money from the central bank or you borrow on the open market. Now you have been asked not to get money from the central bank. Then the next alternative is to borrow. So that is a direct consequence of why we are going to borrow. Now that is not to say that we should open the taps to get money from the central bank. But I personally, again, I am not in favor for purposes of the long term, not in favor of a zero financing, because this is where we have found ourselves. We have found ourselves in a situation where there are times when there will be shocks to your revenue expectations. And you do not want to also go and borrow. You need an overdraft that you can pay back once revenue recovers. For instance, in the first quarter of the year, you find out that revenue is not that buoyant, it's not that strong, because businesses are now putting themselves together and now getting their tax assessment and all those things, So you find out that government revenue during the first quarter, maybe first half of the year, is not so strong. You may want to fall on a 90-day or a 182-day financing from the central bank, to a certain degree, so that by the time revenue starts improving, you have to pay back, And this is where I think that the implementation of the Treasury single account, where only one account of government will be operated at the central bank, is very important, so that once money hits that overdraft-enabled account, it can be taken off to pay that debt, rather than having several accounts here and there where it will be difficult for the central bank to trace government revenue and then pay and get the repayment of that loan. So a consequence of the zero financing is the high borrowing that we will have to face.
We know the current deficit that we have is quite challenging for government, but always we've seen Kenya and also Rwanda taking a decision to finance a dam, that is a Renaissance Dam. They decided to use bonds, targeted bonds, Euro bonds, to finance that particular project. But in Ghana's case, we keep saying, or let's say here, in Euro bonds being, we go to the market, get some bonds, come back, but those monies are just put into the financial market, which we know that such monies, when they enter into that market, it's a hot money. It comes and leaves as fast as it goes. But looking at this particular terrain, would it mean that we'll always be having our debt stock increasing just by using this strategy of just borrowing without targeting project with them?
Well, the factors affecting the debt stock are so many, right? So it's not just about borrowing that will affect your debt stock. There are other factors also.
It's a factor also.
Yeah, but coming to the case of the Kenyans, I think we need to learn this example from the Kenyans. You notice that, like you rightly mentioned, they tend to issue infrastructure bonds to support certain critical infrastructure. And I'm sure by doing that, they will be able to match the cash flow against the liability for that project, so that you can be able to trace and pay. And it is also done over a longer period. So about 15 years infrastructure bond that have been issued, Other than we going onto the Eurobond market, taking monies and then coming to decide what to do with it. And the investors are not really sure what exactly we are going to do with it. And so they tend to add a risk premium on it, because since you are giving someone money which may be diverted or misapplied, there is a risk, So when we begin to learn to issue infrastructure bonds, then it may also help reduce the risk that is assigned to our borrowing. But a good example that we need to also cite, as far as the Ghanaian case is concerned, is the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, which is trying to mimic what will happen or what is happening in Kenya, so that, of course, the fund is not yet fully operational, but once it becomes fully operational, and then they can also go and issue their own bonds against projects. Then you have a situation whereby government would not necessarily have to issue bonds, Euro bonds, against projects and put it on the budget and so on and so forth. So those issuances will be done by the infrastructure funds, and the debts that are taken will be matched against the projects that are going to be invested in, and then the cash flow will then be used to refinance or pay down the debts.
Parliament's decision to take that particular initiative of pushing these loans into play, some would say is another way of not really testing the waters before taking such decision. But would you say it goes to the detriment of our nation going forward because of the perception of political risks and spending during a critical time such as an election year this year?
Well, Parliament will only do what it has to do by checking the details of the loan, and Parliament will only approve a certain amount. And you submit what you are going to do with the loans, But at the end of the day, what you end up doing with the loan may be difficult for Parliament to decide for you. You can put through to Parliament that you are getting this loan to finance infrastructure A. When you get the right amount of money, you go and do infrastructure B. These are issues. I think that, and this is where I think that Parliament may have to find a way of checking the application of debts that they have approved. If you are a sector that approves a certain behavior, now you must follow up, monitor, post disbursement to be sure that that investment is what is being embarked upon. And if the loan is being misapplied, you should have a way of recalling the executive to explain why what they put before you was not being done with what you approved.
We've seen many loans, many grants being given to governments to embark on certain projects. For instance, one very clear example is the one that happened on the Junte disaster, that a Chinese loan was given to ensure that the drainage in Circle was taken care of. But going forward, we hardly see such project being taken in place. Are we not learning lessons in ensuring that there should be proper evaluation and monitoring of government projects to see whether indeed money earmarked for such projects are used exponentially for that particular project?
Well, yeah, that's the whole point I was making about misapplication of loans, And so we should have, if you like, an independent body or Parliament itself checking the use of funds that they have approved to be taken, the use of debts that they have approved to be taken. Because at the end of the day, it falls back on the taxpayer if the loan is not properly used. You see, whenever a government goes for loan, that loan would either be paid from the project that the loan is used to finance, or will ultimately fall on the taxpayer. It will fall on the taxpayer if the loan is not used for the right purpose, or is not used, even if for the right purpose, the returns from that investment is not high enough. So this analysis must be done by a certain sector that will ensure, or entity that will ensure, that the debts and the cost of debts is matched by the investment and the rate of return on that investment.
Having made clear the reasons or the point or the factors that could lead to us having huge debt stances like application of loans and stuff, now that the oil revenues is mostly being the target of refinancing certain projects, what is your recommendation in terms of how government should best restructure the use of revenue? Unlike what happened in Nigeria, where they are at the moment chasing the monies that have been not properly been appropriated for the government projects.
Well, first of all, I think that the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund is one big solution to all of this. Because once that fund begins to get its own financing or funding for infrastructure projects, it is able to do the analysis and decide which project at which particular point in time has the economic viability or financial viability to support the debt and the cost of debt. So I think that going forward, a lot of these debts should be left within the framework of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund. They should be responsible for that, so that government do not have to go into major infrastructure projects that would finally put a burden on the taxpayer, because that is where there is a risk of misapplication. But once you leave it to a semi-autonomous body like the GIIF, they can be able to do their analysis and ensure that debts that are taken are paid back from the projects that were used, the debts were used to finance.
That is a very critical point being raised there. Still on Ghana's case, this time around we move to the banking institutions in the country. It appears by recent reports by the Bank of Ghana reflect that the average interest rate on deposit has dropped to 12.2%. That is according to the figures being released yesterday. The latest annual percentage rate and average interest rate report released by the Bank of Ghana has shown that the average interest rate on deposits have reduced from 12.3% in May to 12.2% at the end of September this year. Out of the 30 banks covered in the report, which the Bank of Ghana says is published to promote transparency in the pricing and provision, it appears the highest rate at the moment is at 15.8% by most commercial banks in the country. So you are investing in the bank, you are having a deposit in the bank. Now we're going to delve into factors that are likely to have led to banks likely to bring down the interest rate down, or possibly add more in terms of attracting clientele to deposit with them.
Well, it tells you something, that the banks are trying to control costs. So the main factor here is that the operating environment is quite difficult and challenging for most businesses, the banks inclusive. And so moving from the stage of retrenchment or layoffs, you want to look at other areas where you can cut costs. And if you look at the bank's cost-income ratio today, within the environment of a high and rising interest rate or high interest rates, their cost of fund is quite high. And cost of fund here, I mean, the banks are businesses that uses money as raw material to produce money. So they take your deposit becomes the raw material, and then they give your deposit to another person as loans, and then he pays back that loans with interest. So they have used money to get money. Now, the money that they are using from deposit is coming at a cost, So as interest rates go up and are high, they also have to keep paying higher and higher on that deposit, and that is high cost of fund, And if you have a situation where their profit is falling, or they are not giving so much loans again because of the current situation where banks have slowed down on loans because of high default rates and all those things. But they will keep paying the deposit, the high deposit. What will happen ultimately is that the costs of deposit as a percentage of the revenue they are getting from interest on loans, it will go up because interest on loans will go down because they are no more giving loans, but they are still paying high interest on deposits. So their cost-income ratio will increase, and that will affect their profitability. So what the banks are currently doing is to find a way around the challenging operating environment that they find themselves in. So some of them have moved from layoffs to now trying to cut on their cost-income ratio, so their cost of deposits, and that is why you see some of them reducing the amount they pay on deposits. Overall, it's going to widen the interest rate spread. The interest rate spread basically is the difference between the lending rate and the deposit rate. So if you have two extremes and one has been reduced, they are going to see that the margin will be wider now. So it is only to help their profit situation, because of the challenging operating environment that they find themselves in.
I had the privilege of having an exclusive interview with the president and founder of the Private Enterprise Federation, Ghana. He's had huge experiences, let's say enormous experience in the banking sector in the United States and United Kingdom. So when it comes to experience and how the products in the banking institutions are, he has tremendous knowledge on that. And he gave quite interesting remark when it comes to the Ghanaian banking sector. He said Ghanaian banking sector are not quite strong enough to inculcate certain policies and projects in order for them to be strong. But that particular statement, would you say that Ghana's case, we still are infant in terms of how we pursue transactions? Because all we see right now is just basically banks depending on deposit and also looking at the treasury bill always.
Yes, and I will agree with him. I think that our financial market is still shallow, although it is growing, but it's still shallow. Shallow in the sense that if you look at the banks, for instance, what is their capital base? What is the minimum regulatory capital? Currently, it's about 120 million cedis. We are discussing, we are aware the central bank is discussing increasing it, Now, the low capital base relative to the size of the economy means that there are certain transactions you can't do because you are going to breach the single obligor limit. Now, the single obligor limit basically says that as a bank, you cannot give loan to a single person in excess of a certain percentage of your capital. Now, what this again means is that then your ability to give loans will be restricted because you have a low capital base. So if there is a very big transaction that you have to do, you can't do it because you are afraid of breaching this single obligor limit. So then the ability to finance and fuel economic growth or support economic growth is restricted. So you need a big capital base. That is where I agree with that statement. That's one area where I agree with that statement. So that the capital base needs to improve to be able to ensure that banks have the muscle to be able to support. Of course, we are going into the oil and gas era, and these are going to be big ticket transactions, And so even the insurance industry will also need to beef up their muscle to support all this activity. So with the area of capital base, I think that we need to improve on that. Then the complexity or level of sophistication of the transactions that we do on our financial market. So currently what the banks do, if you look at their sources of income, the bulk of their income sources is from interest on loans, before you look at other things like investment income as a second source of income. Then you look at other things like fees and commission. Fees and commission is the least of the three. I think that the banks can try and look at other complex transactions like trading of derivatives or whatever, but that would mean that our market will have to develop to a certain stage. And that's why I think that our market is still shallow, because some of these deals, trading of derivatives and currencies and so on and so forth, are not so strong, are not done strong. So you have banks typically relying on a narrow sources of income, and that also affects their profitability when the going gets tough.
It is being assessed per report that it is mostly the private sectors whose deposits with the banks are very huge. But it appears recent interaction and research has revealed that although the government continuously floats bonds and bonds in the domestic market in order to attract more monies to either offset loans or to finance projects, it appears the crowding out of the private sector in terms of accessibility to credit has become a very serious bane on businesses. How can we best address that without not stepping on each other's toe?
Well, the government will have to put right its finances. The main reason why the government is crowding on the private sector is because the government is running high unsustainable fiscal deficits. And so once you run high and unsustainable fiscal deficits, you will need, a deficit is basically your expenditure greater than your revenue. The greater your expenditure above your revenue, the more the gap you will need to fund or finance. And I mentioned earlier that there are two main sources of funding this gap. You borrow from the central bank or you borrow on the open market. Now we are having not to borrow from the central bank because of the IMF policy of zero financing. Then you have to borrow from the market. You borrow from the market, and you, the government, because you are perceived as less or non-risky, you are going to be able to pay, and you are less sensitive to increases in interest rates. So the government can accommodate interest rates so high, but the private sector cannot accommodate any increase or every increase in interest rate because they have to match that against their profitability. Once that happens, you notice that the private sector will step back. The government keeps taking all the credit available in the market, and so the private sector will be credited out. So the best way to address this is to ensure that government readjust and realign its finances so that it doesn't run significant budget deficit again that will lead it to always go and borrow and crowd out the private sector.
There's something about rational decision taking in order to avert risks, which has to do with holding onto money. With time, it loses value. Based on that, mostly the currency situation in the country, there's been a lot of speculation that the cedi is likely to lose in value because of the political situation we are at the moment experiencing, which most have perceived it to be very high. But in that instance, government, would you say government has created enough atmosphere for a stable currency that will not lead to the banks having lost values in terms of how much they keep as deposits?
Well, yes, I would not support the view that the currency would significantly lose value because of the elections. I think that generally the currency would remain within the band that it's been moving in. You know, there is no so much threat that will cause the currency to slide. So I think the market should remain confident that despite the elections, we are going to see a CD that will be generally stable. You know, I mean, the worst days of the CD are behind it, you know, and that's normally in the first half of the year. Even that the CD was able to maintain its relative stability, you may want to flag the elections, and rightly so, because we have a history. But what I also want to advise the market is that this election is a different kind of election. It's an election that is going to happen under the guidance of an IMF program. So fiscal operations are going to be well contained. We've been talking about zero financing, zero financing, zero financing all this while. This is one critical support for the cedi stability, because the government is not getting excess Ghana cedis from the central bank that will now fuel demand for dollars. And because that excess financing from the central bank is not coming to fuel demand for dollars, we should generally expect the cedi to maintain that stability. Now, that is not to say that certain risk-averse individuals will not take positions that will affect the cedi. That risk is there. And for me, that is the risk we need to watch, where even without materialization of this risk from the fiscal end, you could also see situations where just being risk-averse, businesses and individuals start to take decisions that may undermine the cedi stability. But overall, I think the conditions are right. We have a tight fiscal regime, we have a tight monetary regime, all of which is supposed to anchor the demand side. Then we have a situation where the supply side has also been beefed up by the fact that the Cocoa Board inflows, syndicated loan keeps coming in, each and every tranche. Then you have a situation where government issued some Eurobond in September. A portion of it is new cash that will come into the coffers of the central bank. Then you have a situation where the central bank itself in July has already amended the FX repatriation rules, which would allow for exporters who earn foreign currencies to directly sell their foreign currencies into the banking system. They will not have to bring it, surrender it to the central bank, who will now in turn take it back into the... That process is so long and cause some constraint. But once the exporter brings the money in, the FX in, and sells it directly into the banking system, it's direct, and so the supply is quite fluid and liquid, and will deepen transaction on the interbank FX market. So overall, I think the conditions are ripe, and we should generally feel assured that the cedi will generally remain stable. I do not see a catastrophic depreciation in the last 2 months of the year. If there will be an election-related depreciation, we should have started, I mean, from, say, October, you know, and we should be seeing it deeper as we are getting into November. But generally, we are still seeing a relative stability. In the last couple of days, there's been some increase in demand for foreign currency. But I think this is just the regular things you see as we approach the festivities, and not necessarily the elections per se. When you cut out that, I think overall the cedi will remain stable.
I think that is quite exhaustive conversation that has to do with the Ghana's case in terms of fiscal discipline, in terms of currency stability. But let's move to the case of Nigeria. Let's speak to Nigeria's issue before you leave. And Nigeria's Senate dealt unexpectedly an unexpected blow to President Muhammadu Buhari on Tuesday by rejecting his plan to borrow $30 billion abroad for infrastructure projects and budget support until 2018. Senators threw out the plan introduced last week without debate when a surprise Senate President Bukola Saraki held a second vote. Most senators shouted again, "Nay, nay." That is a very interesting, it's a quite obvious conversation in Parliament. Buhari's borrowing plans had included the sale of Eurobonds worth $4.5 billion and planned budget support of $3.5 billion. But it appears all this optimistic budget-related borrowing have been thrown into the trash. In this instance, amidst a very challenging economic recession Nigeria is going through, what is the next option, or what is the last resort, apart from the one that Nigeria, Buhari decided to rely on, which is not seeing any ends meet?
Well, I can imagine the finance minister over there scratching his head, giddy giddy. thinking of where the next budget funding will come from. But I think they need to look inwards, I think there's a lot of loopholes that can be plugged in the Nigerian tax system. They should embark on tax reforms. They should ensure they enforce compliance, tax compliance. If you look at the figures we saw, I think last month or in September, the tax revenue to GDP is still about 15 or below 15%. That is less than where they should be doing as a middle-income country, Nigeria. They should be doing something close to 20 minimum, And even Ghana, we are targeting 20% tax revenue to GDP by the year 2020. As we speak, we are at 17%. So we are even slightly better than Nigeria in terms of tax revenue to GDP. So Nigeria needs to do a lot of work. If Senate decide not to approve this particular financing, they need to begin by looking inwards, how to bootstrap. Then they can also make a stronger case for external funding. I don't want to believe that Senate is totally against external funding. It's either the amount that is being required or the areas of expenditure. So maybe the finance ministry will want to go back and do their own work again, but then they must also complement external funding with improving revenue mobilization from the domestic economy.
Let me take your thoughts on this particular part of the conversation, which has to do with the decision by various agencies that the Nigerian government has been interacting with in order to get enough capital, let's say revenue, to start certain projects in the budget. The government has held talks for months with the World Bank, China, and other institutions to fund a budget, a 2016 budget deficit of 2.2 trillion naira. But so far, only the African Development Bank has publicly confirmed a planned loan of 1 billion naira, $1 billion. Nigeria also wants to sell a $1 billion in euro bonds by the end of the year. And also, in addition to that, Buhari had already sent a draft budget for 2017 to Parliament for approval, detailing plans to spend about 6.866 trillion naira, which is approximately $22.55 billion. Huge sums of money.
Yeah, but we are talking about a huge economy, And you would notice that the external sector are not so convinced yet about giving their money to Nigeria because of the current situation. There are certain things they want to see done, which needs to be done. You mentioned only the AFDB, who have stepped forward to give them about $1.5 billion. Even that, they are going to ensure certain reforms are done. Reforms in the area of foreign exchange market, reforms in the tax administration. So even the AFDB is not just signing the checks, they are conditionally signing the checks. So you can also expect that the external sectors who would put forward certain conditions or would apply a high interest rate because you are a risky borrower, So at the end of the day, whichever side you look at it, it points you to doing certain things right in your economy if you are going to seek external funding.
Conclusively, what will be your projections, or let's say, on Nigeria's economy going forward? Because Moody's and S&P are likely to rate the economy come in December this year.
Well, I think that I will agree with the IMF forecast that Nigeria's economy is likely to contract in 2016. And given that they adjust quickly, or if they adjust quickly, we should see some slightly positive growth in 2017. But that depends again on the adjustment because they are still significantly relying on oil. And so you need to see where the sources of growth will come from beyond the oil sector. Agriculture is very, very strong. I mentioned sometime back that if you look at, despite the negative growth in the second quarter of this year, agriculture grew by about 5%. So you need to look at other sectors of the economy to support growth. But as far as this year is concerned, I think Nigeria will end in a negative growth.
All right. Thank you so much. I think that will be it for the interaction this morning right here on the Trending Economic Issues segment where we always serve you the technical, informed analysis on various economic issues happening across some selected African countries. My guest this morning have been Courage Kingsley Martin. He's an economist with Data Bank Group here in Ghana. Thank you so much, Courage. It's always a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Always quite revealing conversation right here. And I'm sure you always stay tuned with us right here on the Business Africa Live Show. We are streaming online on www.businesstv.africa.com. We'll be bringing you, not in just a few minutes, the case of the Jumura rice, which was unveiled yesterday in Warak district in the Volta region. Is an awesome consumption of the locally produced rice. But let me take a few thoughts on that from Courage. What is your thought on the new project being earmarked by Group Indum, which is also called GM Foods? It's also a subsidiary of the group of companies under Group Indum.
Well, you know, I believe so much in this strategy. This is the way to go. And I'm just looking at the papers, and it's supposed to provide or create 5,000 jobs, you know. So there's the job angle to this. Then there's also the foreign exchange implication of this, because once this particular rice factory grows and is able to meet a lot of capacity or produce a lot of capacity, that would be a savings on how much we bring in, you know. I think that how much we bring in from, and so the amount of money we spend in importing will be saved to support the local currency. Then I also think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, maybe state-led, I don't know, but you need to ensure that the consumers tilt their preference towards local rice. There's good value in local rice, you know, and so we need to ensure that we eat what we grow and we grow what we eat. And I totally support this Ejumara rice.